OK, but now comes the reality of actually reducing emissions. Carbon credits will be key to the government's strategy, but today some of the biggest players profiting from the carbon market have spoken out, calling for reform of the system to ensure its integrity. Now, the types of companies we're talking about are granted carbon credits for each tonne of carbon dioxide or equivalent greenhouse gas they reduce. They do this through the so-called landfill gas method, which captures and combusts methane from decomposing landfill, effectively turning it into the far less damaging carbon dioxide. But speaking to the ABC, the leaders of these companies say carbon credits are sometimes being issued for actions the industry would take anyway, and they're calling for fewer credits to be given to industry. For more on this, we're joined in Canberra by senior researcher at the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, Polly Hemming. I guess, Polly, most people's knowledge of carbon credits and offsets is when they're asked to check a box when they fly. Do you want to offset your carbon emissions? But there's a whole industry behind it. Tell us what carbon credits are and how they are supposed to work.
Sure, you're right. It is sort of an esoteric concept apart from that little box ticking, but there is a whole industry behind it. Carbon credits are generated by activities all across the economy that reduce, avoid or store CO2 or carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions. And that includes activities predominantly in the land sector, things like growing trees or not cutting down trees or getting cattle off land so trees can regrow, but it also includes sort of industrial methods like the one you just mentioned, capturing methane from landfill. And in Australia we have an entire government policy and carbon credit system that awards carbon credits to people who are carrying out these activities. And for every tonne of CO2 that's reduced or avoided or stored, these projects or individuals or businesses are awarded with an Australian carbon credit unit. And the project owners have to follow certain rules. They can't just say, I've planted a tree, can I have a carbon credit? Thank you. They have to follow what's called certain methods or methodology. And that basically ensures that the carbon credit has integrity. And the rules are theoretically meant to be very robust, and they're meant to ensure that the emissions reduction has actually taken place, that it wasn't going to happen anyway, it wasn't something that was already regulated, and it has to be permanent. And once you've proved that you've done that to the body administering this system, the Clean Energy Regulator, they give you the carbon credit, and then you can either sell that back to the government so it can meet its climate targets, or else you can sell it on a voluntary market or secondary market to a business who wants to offset its emissions for various reasons.
Okay, so turning to you, Chris Gambian, you're an environmental consultant. How significant are these carbon credits in Australia meeting that 43% reduction target?
Look, they're hugely important, but we've got to remember that they are just one part of the solution. So Australia's not going to get to 43% reduction in greenhouse gases through carbon credits alone. And some of the problems that have already been identified with the system, a lack of integrity, some really dodgy science and maths going on, they really erode people's trust in how the system works and the credibility of it. And at the end of the day, you can fudge the books as much as you like. The maths is the maths, and either the world is going to stop warming or not. So we've got to make sure that this system is absolutely sort of foolproof. We'll need these credits into the future, but that's not going to be an alternative to doing some of the other heavy lifting we've got to do, like transitioning the energy sector or actually reducing the emissions coming out in the first place. Okay,
so just before we go to the panel, Holly, you said there's supposed to be, Polly, really rigorous accounting around this, but we've seen the chair of the scheme, the scheme's watchdog, calling the whole thing a fraud on the environment. And now we've seen these people who are in the big waste management companies, who are the people who can sell the carbon credits because they're the ones reducing the methane, saying, you know what, it might cost us $1, but we got to tell you, this isn't fair dinkum.
Yeah, that's true. And just to add to what Chris said, it's not just the legitimacy of the credits, it's how they're used as well. If you're a company that is planning on increasing its emissions, but that's okay because you can just buy offsets, that's not credible either, and that will see Australia not meeting its climate targets too.
Because it's like taking the plug out of the bathtub and leaving the tap running. So if people are increasing emissions with that tap running and you've pulled the plug out, the level of the water is going to... The environment doesn't care about that accounting trick, basically.
No, exactly. So even where they do have integrity, offsets don't ever reduce emissions, they just maintain the status quo, and I think that's really important to note, because offsets are sort of being treated as synonymous with emissions reductions under the government's safeguard mechanism, which is another climate policy. But to answer your question, yes, Professor McIntosh from the ANU and a number of his colleagues came out fairly recently saying that 3/4 of Australia's carbon credits are either not real or not additional, but that is also building on years of scrutiny and work by others and other academics, and including the Australia Institute. So there's a significant body of evidence that actually suggests that, despite what the Clean Energy Regulator says, that's the body administering this scheme, despite what governments have said, despite what industry says, apart from these whistleblowers, that there are legitimate issues. And it's really significant that people who are actually making a lot of money from this scheme have had the integrity to come out and say, yeah, no, this is not right, this is not working.
Yeah, and it's interesting from a business point of view, Sam. We've seen John Falzon in this ABC reporting, the chair of LMS Energy, and it was explained in the story that his company, like all the landfill goes in, it produces methane. He burns the methane, converts it to CO2, a less potent greenhouse gas, and then uses the heat to generate electricity. So he makes money by selling these credits. He's going, you know what, I'm getting credits for some of the stuff I would have done anyway. But at the same time, he makes money out of it, so why wouldn't he just shut up and take the cash?
It's a great market opportunity, but I think that Falzon is also in a position where they can be more efficient, perhaps, in the way that they burn off methane and convert it into CO2, which, I mean, is still a greenhouse gas. It's just got a lower CO2 equivalent than methane, so I suppose it's a bit better. But there is a huge market opportunity here for people to create carbon credits, and there is a booming demand for it. And I'm not just talking about these, 215 big emitters that are going to have to be part of this environmental safeguard mechanism that the government's come up with, but even small businesses who are just trying to do their bit to offset, their domestic travel impact and things like that. But there's so much confusion about whether or not an apple equals an apple when it comes to the value of a carbon credit. You've got a voluntary scheme, you've also got what will be a compulsory scheme, which the government's coming up with. And then you've got these ACCUs, which is the Australian Climate
Carbon
Standard
Credit Unit.
Credit, high integrity, but everything else out there. I mean, the price of a tonne of carbon in Australia is about $30. You can also go overseas and buy a carbon credit for a price of about $2 a tonne. So if you're an average Australian, say a small business, and you're trying to do your right thing, trying to offset your environmental impact, you're not quite sure how these ACCUs work, you go overseas. And this is a huge problem that the government has, trying to educate the market, but also come up with a standard measurement.
And Margie, is particularly relevant in your industry, in the travel industry, in terms of trust. When your mouse hovers over that, do you want to offset? There's not a really clear understanding of whether they are genuine and whether they are regulated in a way that would give you confidence.
I mean, it's a critical issue for our industry, particularly for the aviation sector. And if you look at before COVID, nobody bought a ticket or didn't buy a ticket off the basis of what you might have been doing as a company in terms of carbon offsetting or whatever other sustainability choices you made. Now they are. So this is an area of massive focus for the aviation sector, but I take the point that this issue around carbon offsets is only one tiny part of the exercise. For our industry, it's massively about sustainable aviation fuel, being able to manage the waste in a different way by producing this kind of fuel. There's only been one refinery announced here in Australia. It's going to be huge, and you see airports all over the country, and airlines like Qantas and Virgin are now incredibly focused focused on getting to this space. And we need something like the Jet Council, which they have in the UK, to regulate and deal with these sorts of issues for the aviation sector.
And it does seem, Chip, like there's a role for government here to be more rigorous when, as you were saying to me before we came to air, you've got individual companies and consumer organisations trying to authenticate what's going on, which seems like a very roundabout way to ensure that you've got trust and authenticity.
Well, it's part of that trust issue, and the fact that the trust is eroding, that people are taking, companies and people are taking it upon themselves to find out, well, I need to find one with integrity. I need to find carbon credits with integrity. So they're doing that investigative work themselves. But yeah, be much better if we all had a standard that we could rely on and trust, so that integrity is there in the system. But also, like in terms of, you know, like keeping us back to level pegging, as our guest reminded us, what really needs to happen in addition to a sustainable flow in the aviation industry is we just need to have wholesale conversion to renewable energy. And that's that we need a mechanism that makes that happen, so that anything that we're doing at home or in small businesses is not contributing or increasing our net emissions.
Rather than trying to buy it off. Polly, you're trying to get in?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's really important to note that Australia's carbon credits are nominally one of the most well-regulated and robust in the world, and we've seen that 3/4 of our carbon credits are not real or not additional. So you're right that there's a whole landscape internationally of credits that could be who knows what, but just because we have a government nominally regulating our carbon credits doesn't mean that they're quality. And I think that's quite terrifying, and shows that actually this is, you know, carbon credits and offsets, while they may have a role to play, if the scheme is inherently uncertain, then that is an enormous risk, even relying on that as a central part of your climate policy.
Because you won't find out till you get there that you haven't reduced emissions enough, Margaret.
Just one other quick thought in this space is that this is a massive growth industry, and one of the biggest skill shortages we have all over the world, but particularly here in Australia, is people to help measure, regulate, develop, do all of the work in this sustainability space. And it's going to be one of the areas that if governments and the private sector have a hope of meeting targets, we're going to have to see massive increase in training and probably skilled migration to help us to have the people to actually deliver on this.
Okay, so Polly, the government's got 4 independent experts reviewing these carbon credits, and whistleblowers like the chair of the scheme's watchdog calling it a fraud on the environment. Yourself, you used to work for the industry department until you decided that you'd be better off outside, speaking plainly about the authenticity and the integrity of all this. Does the government know it has a problem, and what's it going to do about it?
I think the fact that our carbon credits are being reviewed, or at least 4 of the methods are being reviewed, is indicative of the fact that the government knows there is a problem that needs to be managed. That doesn't necessarily mean that the government knows how significant the problem is. So just going back to the fact, yes, we have an independent panel reviewing these credits, but members of that panel are also involved with the carbon industry. So there's some questions about how independent that truly is. The terms of reference for the review suggest that these 4 methods will be looked at. One of them is the landfill gas method. It's also addressing the governance of the Clean Energy Regulator, which has come under significant scrutiny for the way it's managed this scheme, but also significant conflicts within the governance of the scheme. But if you look at the rest of the terms of reference, it's all about getting increasing benefits into carbon credits, you know, whether it's benefits for landholders or Indigenous communities or biodiversity benefits. So the fact that you're actually, you know, looking at trying to cram more into the carbon credit scheme without adequately addressing what the scheme is fundamentally based on, which is emissions reduction, show that perhaps they're not actually committed to credibly addressing any issues that do arise. I'd also point out that the government's, you know, in the process of consulting on the safeguard mechanism, which is that climate policy and the compliance component of offsetting that that you mentioned before.
And this is big emitters who are going to have to ratchet down their emissions in part by buying climate credits. So they're pushing ahead with that policy.
Yeah.
But they
They're
haven't
pushing
worked
ahead with
out
that
whether or not
policy,
the climate credits that they're going to be buying are actually genuine. They might be buying 3 magic beans.
Well, exactly. So the findings of that of the carbon credits review will be handed over in December. Draft legislation for the safeguard mechanism will be developed in November. So that to me is incredibly concerning, that it's sort of full steam ahead. We're not anticipating any problems. Minister Bowen himself has encouraged participation in the carbon market. In the meantime, has said the carbon market will be bigger under Labor, not smaller. So to me, it's very difficult to see how this review is not a box-ticking exercise.
Chris, the final one to you. It's an interesting confluence of events, isn't it? We see this climate change legislation enshrining the 43% reduction today. Full steam ahead, says the minister. And yet, this big chunk of how we're going to get these emissions down, 10 to 15% of how we're going to get to that target, nobody has complete confidence that is real emissions reduction.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
Well, let me hear Chris.
Well, I think the thing is that recognising that the system of carbon credits has been so fundamentally broken under the previous government was an important first step. Now, I think everything that Polly said makes all the sense in the world, but we're going to need credible carbon credits. There is just no way that we can get to the kind of emission reduction that we need in the time frame that we need them without some sort of credit system. But it has to be a system that's got integrity. So by Bowen recognising first up that there's problems here, we need to deal with them, getting that in place, then saying, okay, full steam ahead, we're going to 43%, we're not going to achieve that just by the things that we've got going on at the moment. We need to get to better than zero by 2050 is the reality. You just can't do it. There are whole sectors that can't transition yet because we don't have the technology. The Royal Flying Doctors are going to need to be able to offset the miles that they do in their planes for a good long while yet, but we can't afford for that carbon to be in the atmosphere unchecked. So having a credible system needs to run parallel with the emissions reduction target.
So you've got to get the real emissions down, and for those sectors that can't offset, you're going to have real carbon credits that have integrity for them to buy. Thanks to...
I'll just say
yes,
one
Polly?
more thing on that. It's not those good faith buyers who are buying Australian carbon credits. It's the big emitters. It's gas companies.
Right.
It's coal companies who are buying Australian carbon credits because they have to. And a really important thing to note is that under the safeguard mechanism, there are no requirements to reduce emissions. So you can offset as an alternative to reducing, and even if the carbon credits have integrity, that means you are buying carbon credits year on year just to stay in the same position. So I agree that an important and robust carbon credit system is critical for those hard to abate sectors. It's not the hard to abate sectors who are covered by the safeguard. It's predominantly gas and coal.
At a time when mining company gross operating profits are up 51% over the year and 94% above pre-COVID levels. Interesting. Polly Hemming, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.